Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's story. I invite you to sit back, settle in, and let your thoughts drift away as we embark on a slow and thoughtful journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we begin unraveling an old tapestry woven with whispers from the past, tales of forgotten medieval survival techniques we ignore, and more. These are not the stories etched in stone monuments or recited in grand halls. No, these are quieter things, subtle gestures of resilience and artful wisdom passed from hand to hand, hut to hut, over smoky hearths and cold mountain paths. You might be surprised to know how much of their world we've let slip away. They survived with no electricity, no antibiotics, no supermarkets, and no phones. And yet, through simplicity, ingenuity, and connection to the land, they endured centuries. In the soft glow of candlelight, they stitched together survival with patience and care. Over the next 24 nights, we'll walk together through the forests and fields, past crumbling abbeys and sleeping villages, to meet the world as it once was. We'll explore what they did, how they lived, and why their lost ways might just hold the keys to something we're missing today. So let's begin with the first piece of this story. It was the winter of 1348 in a quiet corner of the Pyrenees. Snow had settled early, a blanket thick and soft as wool. Beneath the canopy of spruce and ash, an old woman known only as Mirelda tended to her fire. Her stone hut was no larger than a shepherd's shelter, and yet within its walls the wisdom of 3 generations lingered like the scent of dried herbs above the hearth. Mirelda, bent with years and wind, moved not with weakness, but with a sort of ritual grace. Everything in her world was deliberate. Every log placed in the fire, every pinch of sage to the pot, every knot tied into cord. And it was not because she had the luxury of time, but because survival depended on care. Her world was small, and yet it was vast in knowledge. Each morning began not with the sun, but with the stars. Before the first blue-gray light, she would rise, pulling a robe of wool over her shoulders and press her ear to the wind. She did not simply guess the weather, she read it. The bark of a birch tree told her the night's humidity. The direction of the owl's call revealed the movement of air. By the time the first crow stirred, Mirelda had already collected the morning's eggs, soaked the beans in ash-laced water to break down their bitterness, and slipped out to the forest with her walking staff, an oak branch darkened by decades of touch. She carried no iron, no steel, only a blade of carved obsidian tied with sinew to its wooden hilt, passed from mother to daughter, a relic from before anyone remembered. But it was not just tools that kept her alive. It was the rhythm, the pulse of the land. She knew the time of year by the change in birdsong, the quality of frost on leaves, the way shadows fell across her stone threshold. In the glade, beneath a thick tangle of briar and bramble, she uncovered a patch of wintergreen. Its leaves were small, waxy, and stubborn, but powerful, for toothaches, for aching joints, for flavoring stew in lean times. It's hard to imagine now, in our world of abundance, what hunger does to the mind, how it sharpens or breaks you. But Mirelda, like many of her time, didn't just endure it. She had systems, a survival calendar invisible to outsiders. She fermented pine bark for emergencies, baked acorns into cakes after leaching their tannins for 3 days. She made vinegar from wild apples and stored smoked meats in clay jars buried just beyond the frost line. Not out of curiosity, out of necessity. When neighbors, rare visitors from the lower valley, climbed the frozen ridge, they came not to gossip but to barter. A jar of pickled beets for a skein of wool, a bone needle for a charm of garlic bound with rue. Mirelda's reputation was soft-spoken but firm. She never took more than she needed. She never gave less than she promised. There was a code, unwritten but known. In the absence of laws, there was trust. And perhaps most curiously, she kept no mirror. None in her house. No reflection beyond a frozen pond or a copper bowl of water. To her, beauty was in function. A well-mended boot, a clean blade, a story remembered. One evening, as snow fell in wet, slow clumps against her roof, a boy arrived at her door. He had walked 6 miles in the dark, led by his grandfather's tale of Mirelda, the woman who knew the winter. His mother was ill, a fever that would not break. The church had no answers. The local healer had moved south. Mirelda said nothing. She let him speak. Then, in a quiet dance of fingers, she began. A twist of elderflower, the bark of willow, a satchel of dried linden, a beeswax wrap soaked in camphor and pine sap, and finally a few husks of garlic, roasted black. Steep, do not boil, 2 days. She sent him home without coin, without promise, only the silent exchange of care. And in that exchange, something larger lived. These were not tricks, not superstition. They were observations accumulated over time, patterns witnessed, tested, recorded in memory. Modern science would validate some of it centuries later. But Merelda had no laboratories. She had only eyes, ears, touch, repetition. When we look back at this time, we often do so with a dismissive lens, thinking of peasants as ignorant, primitive. But what if ignorance isn't the lack of facts, but the absence of attention? Merelda's world required deep attention, and it repaid her for it. She survived 3 plagues, 4 harsh winters. She outlived every ruler of her region, not by luck, but by rhythm. And as she drifted to sleep that night, the scent of pine smoke curling upward, she whispered a word her mother had once whispered to her. Remember. We'll pause here, with the fire still glowing. When you're ready, we'll continue deeper into the forest of forgotten ways. The morning after the boy had left, Merelda's home was quieter than usual. The fire had long since died down to a smolder, casting only the faintest amber glow upon the stone walls. Outside, snow had gathered thickly on the thatched roof, bending the branches of the nearby pine trees into deep arches. The forest exhaled a hush that only winter could bring. Merelda sat at her low wooden table, her fingers carefully winding twine around the base of a bundle of dried mullein stalks. To the untrained eye, they might look like weeds, tall and spindly with soft, velvet-like leaves. But to her, they were torches in waiting. Long before oil lamps and candles became common, those in the highlands crafted light from what nature gave freely. The dried stalks of the mullein plant, when soaked in rendered animal fat, burned with a slow, steady flame. They were called witches' candles by some, but for Merelda and those like her, they were just light, warmth against the deep dark. With each twist of twine, her mind wandered to her mother's voice, now decades gone but never faded. She remembered sitting by that same table as a child, watching hands more wrinkled than her own now, dipping stalks into a pot of melting fat and setting them to dry by the fire. Light is not given, her mother would say. It is built, it is earned. Merelda had learned early that every element of survival required effort, layered with care. She finished binding the last stalk and placed it on the stone ledge by the window to cure. Then she reached for her gathering satchel, a simple leather pouch with patches worn smooth from years of use. Today's task was different. She would walk farther than usual. There was a grove deep in the valley, past the frozen creek and beyond the crooked stone marker that jutted like a broken tooth from the earth. In that grove, beneath a protective net of evergreens, grew the staghorn club moss, a plant with spores more flammable than dry flour. In the old days, it was used not only to start fires, but in rituals for revealing illness, tossed into the flames to read the direction of the smoke. To Merelda, it was simply useful and dangerous. A pinch too much could flash in your face. She stepped out into the snow, boots crunching softly against the crusted surface. Her breath rose in white clouds, curling like the smoke from her long-cooled hearth. The cold did not bother her. She was layered in garments spun from her own flock's wool, dyed with walnut hulls and onion skins, earthy hues, unseen in the snow. As she walked, she listened, not just to the trees creaking under snow's weight, but to the way the snow crunched to the birds overhead or lack thereof. Every sound was information. The path she took was invisible to all but her. A series of landmarks stored in memory. The tree split by lightning 3 winters ago, the stone that resembled a bear's paw, the hollow log that whispered when the wind blew just right. She reached the grove by mid-morning. The club moss was half covered in snow, but she knew where to find it. With careful fingers, she brushed away the white, uncovering the delicate spine-like green fronds. She gathered only what she needed, no more. That was the rule. As she worked, she thought again of the boy. She had sent him off with more than just medicine. She had slipped a small pouch into his pocket, tied with red thread. Inside was a dried toadflax bloom, a few grains of salt, and a feather from a jay. Not magic, at least not the way others thought of it, but memory. Each item carried a story, and stories, she believed, were stronger than any charm. The feather meant adaptability, the salt, preservation. the flower endurance in bitter conditions. Survival, she knew, wasn't just about food or fire. It was about will, the belief that one could endure. She returned to her hut by late afternoon, her hands raw from the cold but her steps steady. She placed the gathered spores in a clay vessel, sealed with beeswax. Nearby, bundles of herbs hung like sleeping bats, yarrow, angelica, valerian, all part of her unseen armor against the world. Merelda's hut was not cluttered, but everything had a place, a story, a purpose. A small carved figurine near the hearth, her father's. A hollowed-out antler used to funnel smoke into wounds. A square of fabric embroidered with a starburst, her mother's symbol for protection. In modern times, we might call it superstition. But for those who lived by the edge of survival, every object was layered with meaning. Symbols reminded them of patterns. Patterns guided action. And action, repeated and trusted, became ritual. That night, as the stars brightened in a sky as cold and clear as glass, Merelda sat by the fire, a single mullein torch casting a slow-burning light. She closed her eyes, listening not to the wind or the cracking of snow-laden branches outside, but to something deeper, the space within. That quiet that only comes when the body is still and the soul is at peace with knowing it has done what it must. In that silence, she remembered again what her mother once whispered as they watched the fire take hold of the kindling. The world is always telling you how to live. Most just forget how to hear it. And with that, Merelda let herself drift into sleep, into the folds of another winter night, surrounded by ancient tools, soft firelight, and the quiet breath of the forest outside. We will return again soon to pick up this thread where it was left and follow it deeper into the quiet wisdom of forgotten survival. Days passed in silence, as they often did in the hills. But on the fifth morning after the boys' visit, Merelda stood at the edge of her doorway, her eyes tracing the horizon beyond the valley fog. She did not move. She simply stared, her breath shallow, her posture tense, not with fear, but with the sense that the world had shifted. She had felt it in her dreams the night before, a white deer standing in a burning field, and the sound of river stones tumbling in reverse. Dreams, to Merelda, were not idle fictions of the mind. They were echoes, and some echoes carried weight. She turned back inside, moving toward a small wooden box carved from elder. Its lid bore the markings of a sun within a circle, her grandmother's symbol for cycles and insight. Inside were only 3 items: a smooth piece of jet, a dried toad's tongue, and a thin coil of iron wire. She touched each gently before closing the lid again. When one lived alone for so long, there was a language made not of words, but of signs. Subtle changes in the environment, in the behavior of birds, in the silence of the forest. Merelda had felt the weight in the air, the kind that settled low behind the sternum, whispering not of danger, but of change. She set about her tasks with greater intention that day. The fire was stoked higher. More logs were brought in, stacked in an orderly pyramid beside the hearth. She boiled a strong decoction of horehound and wild cherry bark, something to strengthen the lungs should the air turn bad. By midday, a soft knock rapped against her wooden door. A knock, not a hand. It was the end of a walking staff. When she opened it, a man stood there, wrapped in a faded cloak, wet from snow. His beard was salted with gray, and though his hands were rough, they trembled slightly as he removed his hood. "Merelda?" he asked, though he already knew. She stepped aside and let him in, motioning toward the stool nearest the fire. He sat without a word. The two of them remained in silence for a long while, the only sound the faint pop of a knot in the burning wood. Merelda served him a small cup of warm mead, laced with thyme and juniper. He drank slowly, as though each sip rewound time. "My name is Jason," he said finally. "I come from beyond the southern road. My wife, she is gone. The fever took her last month. My daughter is all I have left. She's not sick, but changed. She won't speak, won't eat unless I coax her, stares at the snow as if waiting for something." Merelda said nothing. She rose and poured more mead. Jason's eyes followed the flickering torchlight across her shelves. "They said you remember things others forget," he murmured, "that you keep the old ways, that you don't ask questions." Still, she said nothing, only placed a piece of bread in his hand and motioned for him to eat. It was only after the fire burned down to soft embers that she finally spoke. "The mind doesn't break from sorrow," she said quietly. "It turns, like a wheel, but some forget how to turn back. Jason's eyes glistened. He nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting her words carried more than explanation. She began to prepare, not with potions or incantations, but with simple, grounded things. She packed a satchel with smooth stones, a small jar of bear fat, dried orange peel, and a carved spindle of yew wood. She would go with him at first light. That night, she did not sleep in her bed. Instead, she laid a pelt by the hearth, letting the heat sink into her bones. It had been years since she had left her hollow, her sanctuary among the trees. But there were times, rare, unspoken, when the healer walked toward the wound. At dawn, the forest was shrouded in silver mist. They traveled in silence, Jason guiding her with care, supporting her over frozen roots and steep inclines. Along the way, Merelda stopped to collect odd things: a feather caught in thorns, a sprig of mint poking through snow, a clump of moss cradling a single drop of frozen dew. Each item she placed into a pouch with quiet reverence. When they reached the cabin, it sat crooked on its stone base, like it had been nudged by time. Smoke still curled from the chimney, but the air felt paused, as though even the wind did not dare enter. Inside, the girl sat by the window. She was perhaps 10 winters old, with hair the color of burnt flax. She did not turn when the door opened. She did not blink when Jason whispered her name. Merelda approached slowly, not like a stranger, but like one returning from far away. She sat beside the child and placed her spindle on the windowsill, letting the morning light catch the grooves. She then drew a small circle of stones on the floor. Nothing grand, just enough to frame a space. From her pouch, she took the moss, the feather, the mint, arranged them without pattern, without comment. Then, gently, she reached for the child's hand. It was cold, limp, but not lost. She whispered not in Latin or chant, but in old tongue, words passed down from the mountains, words that had no translation but were understood by the body. As she spoke, Jason watched. His breath caught in his chest. For a moment, the room did not feel like a room at all, but a space between things, between pain and healing, between presence and memory. And then the girl's fingers twitched. Her lips parted slightly. She looked at Merelda, not with fear, but with a slow recognition, like remembering the shape of warmth. Merelda said nothing more. She only gave a slow nod, then stood. By sunset, she was already walking back toward her home, the satchel lighter, the air different. Jason watched her go, eyes full of something that had no name but lived between gratitude and wonder. And in her hut that evening, Merelda returned to her place by the fire, setting the pouch beside her. She reached for a small piece of wood and began to carve. Not with haste, but with the same care she gave everything. One line at a time, one motion. Because healing, like survival, was not about fixing. It was about remembering, reweaving what had come undone. And as the stars returned, glinting over the snow-covered trees, Merelda hummed a tune she hadn't sung in decades, one her grandmother had sung while washing roots in the stream below the hills. The notes were soft, almost imperceptible, but somewhere in the distance, a child stirred in her sleep, dreaming not of snow or silence, but of warmth, of spinning wood, and of moss that glowed green even in the deepest winter. It was late February when the wind shifted. Merelda could feel it in the way the smoke from her chimney no longer curled straight into the sky, but wavered, dancing sideways as it beckoned elsewhere. The snow had crusted into a brittle shell, and beneath it, the earth pulsed with quiet intent, slowly waking from its slumber. Merelda's dreams had grown restless, not troubled, but layered. Each night she saw flashes, hands pressing seeds into dark soil, a raven perched atop a barn roof, the sound of bells far away, muffled by mist. They were fragments, nothing more, but fragments were how she read the future. Not in visions, in echoes. She began preparations, not because something was wrong, but because something was about to begin. In the corner of her home stood a tall wooden chest. It bore no ornamentation, but its surface gleamed with the oil of many winters' touch. Inside it were things she had not used in years. She opened it gently, as if not to startle what lay within. Out came a long woolen shawl, dyed with crushed berries, faded now to a dusky plum. She pressed it to her face, inhaling the scent of cedarwood in memory. Beneath it, a set of tools wrapped in a linen cloth, a bone-handled awl, a flat stone worn to a smooth edge, and a spindle with one carved petal missing, worn from decades of use. These were not tools of healing or fire-making. These were tools of preparation, of the sowing season. Spring was still a month away, but in her world, survival did not wait for permission. The ground had to be ready long before the thaw, before the sun softened the frost, before the rains returned. She stepped outside that morning into a stillness so complete it rang in her ears. No birds yet, no thawing creeks, only the steady drip of melting snow from her eaves. But she saw the signs, a patch of soil where the frost line had retreated, a line of ants returning, sluggish but determined, across the stone path, a hawk circling lower than usual. Merelda worked in silence. She did not plow, not in the way the villagers did. She used a digging stick, its end fire-hardened and wrapped with sinew. Her garden was small and circular, designed to capture the warmth of the sun from all sides. Around the outer edge, she placed flat stones to hold the heat after sunset, a practice her mother had taught her, handed down from a time when nights were longer and colder still. Each motion had meaning. She did not simply dig. She listened to the sound of soil, the resistance of roots, the way the earth sighed when loosened. There was a rhythm, and she followed it, never breaking the silent pact between human and land. Before she placed a single seed, she performed the old rite, not for luck, but for balance. She knelt at the edge of the garden and pressed her hand into the soil, letting her warmth seep downward. "I borrow this ground," she whispered, "and I repay with care." Then she stood and unwrapped the seed bundle. Inside were not just seeds, but tiny bundles of lineage, barley, dried peas, flax, and 3 kernels of red corn, rare and potent, kept for seasons of change. She did not plant the corn. Not yet. That seed was a promise, and promises must wait. Instead, she pressed the peas into the softened earth first, covering them with a fine mix of ash and composted leaves. She scattered crushed eggshells over the top, offering calcium, but also discouraging the slugs that would come later. The rituals were subtle, practical, woven into habit. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of her neck. She stood slowly, brushing the soil from her hands onto her skirt, then walked to the back of the house where her bees slept. The hive was silent now, covered with a layer of dried moss and wool to guard against frost. She placed her ear against the wood and closed her eyes. A hum, faint, but there. The bees had made it through another winter. Merelda smiled, not because it was rare, but because it was sacred. Without bees, there was no life in the garden, no flowers to fruit, no seeds to return. She spent the rest of the afternoon mending, nets, ropes, even the woven sling she used to carry stones from the river. Her fingers moved with a memory all their own, tracing patterns as ancient as language, over and under, twist and pull, knot and release. As dusk began to fall, she lit a torch, not for warmth, but to signal the end of labor. Her day was not measured by hours, but by light, and the torch was a kind of punctuation. She sat by the fire that evening with her shawl around her shoulders and a cup of warm nettle tea in hand. On the wall, shadows flickered, long and slow, like dancers from another time. She reached for a wooden box and opened it to reveal a set of carved discs, each bearing a symbol etched deep into the grain. Not runes, not letters, but guides. One disc showed a spiral, another a crossed branch, the third a crescent with 3 dots. She drew them not to divine, but to remember. These were tokens of season and story, markers in the long path of the year. The spiral reminded her of renewal, the crossed branch of choice, the crescent of stillness before change. She laid them out before her, studied them, then returned them to their place. Because survival was not only in food and fire, it was in attention, in quiet witnessing, in readiness. And so, as the torch burned low and the wind turned soft, Merelda whispered once more to the night, "You do not ask spring to come. You prepare, and it arrives." Beyond the trees, the stars blinked steadily, like ancient watchers keeping tally of every planted seed, every whispered vow, every act of care too small for history books, but large enough to keep a soul alive. The days began to stretch, just slightly, like fingers waking from a long sleep. Where once the sun vanished by late afternoon, now it lingered a little longer at the edge of the sky, painting the snow in gold instead of gray. Merelda moved with that light, rising before it and finishing her work as it dipped behind the hills. Each day was a ritual, each task a step in a dance as old as the soil beneath her feet. This morning, she woke to the distant sound of melting ice cracking in the ravine. Not a loud sound, but sharp, like flint-splitting wood. It meant the lower streams would soon begin their slow return, threading through the underbrush like veins. With them would come the frogs, the minnows, and the danger of early flooding. Merelda knew the order of things. She adjusted the stones at the base of her garden, building small trenches to direct the future flow. Inside, she unwrapped a small package of dried burdock roots. Their scent was earthy, bitter, grounding. She placed a few slivers into the kettle that hung above her hearth, letting the slow boil pull out their strength. Burdock was not only for the blood, but for the soul, cleansing and centering, a drink for those who needed grounding when the season shifted. As she sipped, she stared into the fire, watching the logs curl and collapse into ash. There was a memory there, tucked into the shadows of the flames. She was a girl again, 10 winters old, carrying water from the stream in clay jugs. Her mother had followed behind her, humming, weaving reeds into a net that would later hang by their doorway. The net wasn't to catch fish, but dreams. Her mother believed that certain weavings could hold memories, good ones, and keep them safe through the turning of the year. Merelda had woven her own nets now, and not all were for memories. One in particular, strung above her bed, was laced with rosemary and tiny carved beads of bone, a protection net. Against what? She could not always say. But there were nights when dreams came sharp as splinters. It helped to have something above her to catch them. That afternoon, as the wind rose from the south, she ventured out to the edge of the clearing where a lone hawthorn tree stood. Its branches were still bare, but small buds had begun to form, tight fists of green waiting for the sun's permission. The hawthorn was not just a tree, it was a sentinel. Long ago, her grandmother told her that hawthorn trees were bridges between worlds, between waking and dreaming, between what was seen and what was hidden just behind the veil of mist. Merelda approached it slowly, her hand brushing the bark. She removed a small pouch from her belt and scattered the contents at the base. Dried apple peel, crushed rosehip, a pinch of honeycomb. A gift, not for the tree, but for what watched through it. She whispered, "I see, and I am seen. No more." That was enough. On her return, she stopped at the stream near the bend where the stones formed a shallow basin. Ice still clung to its edges, but in the center, water danced, clear and cold. She knelt and dipped her hands in, cupping the water and letting it fall back through her fingers like silk. The forest, too, was beginning to wake. She could hear it in the way the branches creaked, not brittle, but shifting, testing their strength. A fox crossed her path as she rose, not startled, not rushed. It paused, looked at her with eyes like polished amber, then trotted on, vanishing into the thicket. Merelda nodded once in quiet recognition. In her world, animals were not signs to be interpreted. They were neighbors. They came and went as they pleased, carrying their own lives, their own weather. But sometimes their presence meant it was time to pay attention. Back home, she opened the bundle of flax fibers she had prepared weeks earlier. Now, they were ready to be spun. She set the spindle beside her, ran her fingers through the softened strands, and began. The motion was soothing. Draw and twist, draw and twist. Her foot tapped a quiet rhythm on the packed earth, echoing the lull of the season's patience. Flax had many uses, but to Merelda, its strength was symbolic. It started stiff and brittle, needing water, fermentation, and beating to become soft. Only then could it be drawn into thread. It reminded her of people, how hardship in the right hands became resilience. As the thread grew, winding onto the spindle, she thought again of Jason and his daughter. She had not heard word from them since returning, but that did not concern her. Healing, true healing, was not a spectacle. It was a quiet unfolding, like the hawthorn bud, like the flax beneath her fingers. That night, she lit a beeswax candle instead of a torch. Its light was warmer, more golden, casting long, dreamy shadows that swayed as if breathing. She placed a small bowl of dried lavender and chamomile on the hearthstone, letting the heat release their scent into the air. Sleep came slowly, as it often did when spring edged closer. Her body was tired, but her mind wandered. Not restlessly, but like a traveler moving down a familiar path, noting each tree and turn along the way. In her dream, she was walking barefoot through damp grass. The stars above were too many to count, yet none too bright to look upon. Ahead of her stood the hawthorn tree, now in bloom, its branches heavy with white flowers that pulsed like slow heartbeats. She reached out, and just before her fingers touched the petals, she woke. The fire had gone low, the candle nearly spent. But in the window, framed by frost, the first crocus of the season had opened in the moonlight, trembling softly in the cold. Merelda smiled. The earth was listening, and so was she. The rains came 3 days later, soft at first, like whispers falling from the sky. Then steadier, more confident, a rhythm tapping against the wooden shingles of Merelda's roof, drumming on the barrels she kept beneath the eaves. Rain in early March was no enemy. It meant the world was beginning to breathe again. The deep inhale before a green exhale across the land. Merelda stood beneath the awning of her doorway, hands tucked into the folds of her wool cloak, watching the water pool along the garden's edge. Her trench work held. The runoff she had dug earlier that month carried the overflow to the mossy path beyond the trees. She nodded quietly to herself. One of the greatest tools in her life had never been made of iron or stone. It was foresight. With the rains came smell, deep, loamy earth, soaked leaves, the faint spice of wet pine. These were scents of awakening, of the season stretching into itself. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the memory of 1,000 other springs settle into her bones. Inside, the warmth of the hearth wrapped around her like an old shawl. She set a small pot to simmer, dropping in slices of dried carrot, a handful of barley, and a single smoked root of celeriac. These were not grand ingredients, but each had been kept with intention, stored in clay jars lined with beeswax, checked every month for rot or mold. Her root cellar was no more than a hole in the ground with stone walls, but it was dry, cool, and constant. She had made it so. The smell of the stew filled the hut with a kind of comfort that words rarely matched. She stirred slowly, her wooden spoon tracing circles in the broth as her thoughts wandered. Not forward, not back, but inward. Rainy days had a way of turning the mind in on itself. They softened the edges of time. Later that afternoon, when the rain paused, Merelda stepped outside with a woven basket strapped across her shoulder. She headed into the lower woods, where the ground turned to sponge beneath her boots and moss covered everything like a second skin. She was searching for something specific, velvet-capped mushrooms that grew only in the days after the first spring rain, hiding in shadowed pockets where the sun had yet to reach. They were rare and precious, not for eating, but for dyeing cloth. Merelda had never been a woman of bright colors. The tones she wore were drawn from the land, dull ochres from onion skins, dusty greens from nettle, rich browns from acorn husks. But these mushrooms, when dried and brewed in alum, gave off a violet hue, faint and ephemeral, like the sky just before dusk. She found 3 beneath the roots of a fallen elm, small but healthy. She harvested them carefully, placing them in the basket wrapped in cloth. As she moved back through the woods, she gathered birch bark too, the papery kind that peeled away in curls, excellent for starting fire in wet weather. Nothing wasted. Everything counted. The sky darkened earlier than expected that evening. Heavy clouds rolled in low and slow, and the air grew cooler, tighter. Merelda sealed her windows with thick cloth and lit a fire high. She ground the mushrooms gently on a slate stone, then placed them in a small cauldron with water and vinegar, letting them steep as the color bled slowly into the liquid. Deep purple, smoky and soft. It reminded her of twilight on riverbanks long forgotten. As the dye simmered, she retrieved a bundle of homespun wool, cut from the fleece of a lamb she'd once raised and shorn with care. She soaked the wool in warm water and alum, then lowered into the dye with reverence. The color would never be permanent, this she knew. It would fade over years, slowly, gracefully. But that was the nature of all things. Even fading had beauty. While the wool absorbed the violet, Merelda took to writing. Not letters, for she had no one to send them to, but records, thin pieces of bark and pressed pulp she kept tied together with twine. Her script was delicate, each letter a careful echo of the old mountain alphabet her grandmother had taught her by candlelight. She wrote of the rain, of the mushrooms, of the crocus bloom outside her window and the new crack forming in the ridge stone near the well. To others these might seem idle observations, but to Merelda it was data, patterns that over time told the true rhythm of the land. She had volumes of these pages, stacked in hollow logs and wax-sealed jars. She called them her listening books, because that was all they truly were, the record of a life spent listening closely. Just before midnight, as the last log in the fire popped and split, she retrieved the wool from the dye. It was light, almost mist-colored, with a breath of lavender in its hue. She held it up to the firelight, watching the way it caught the flicker. It reminded her of her mother's hands, rough with work, but always cradling something fragile. She laid the wool across a drying rack and turned toward the window. The rain had returned, tapping gently now, like fingers on glass. And in the soft rhythm of water and flame, she hummed a lullaby. Not for herself, but for the garden below, for the seeds resting in the dark, damp soil, for the fox curled beneath the yew tree, for the sleeping bees and moss-covered stones, for the memory of those who once lived by these same rhythms, before roads were paved, before the world forgot how to read the silence between storms. Merelda listened a little longer. Then she blew out the candle and let the dark settle gently around her. The rain ended with a hush, not a final drop, but a lingering pause, as if the sky had grown weary and decided to rest. The morning that followed was silver, not bright, not gray, just soft. Mist clung to the treetops, draping the world in a veil so fine it made everything feel further away and closer all at once. Merelda rose slowly, her joints reluctant after the damp night, but her breath steady and full. She wrapped herself in the newly dyed wool, still faintly carrying the scent of vinegar and smoke. The color had deepened slightly overnight as she had hoped, a twilight shade, soft as silence. She did not smile, but she felt the quiet satisfaction move through her like warm tea. Outside, the earth was transformed. What had been frozen and still only a week before was now restless. Puddles reflected trees like old mirrors. Worms surfaced in twisting spirals across the moss. The bark of the trees glistened, darker and alive. Merelda did not go to her garden, not yet. Today was for gathering something older. Deep in the forest, beyond the stone ridge and the black stump split by lightning, lay a clearing known only to her and perhaps the crows. It was not a place for food or water, but for memory. At its center stood a stone circle, not grand like the ones in distant lands, but small, lichen-covered and leaning. Each stone was the height of a child's knee, placed in a perfect ring, untouched by human hands for generations. She did not visit often, only when something in the air shifted, when the forest whispered not of survival, but of remembrance. She packed lightly, a satchel of dried apple slices, a small pouch of juniper berries, a bone comb, and a single beeswax candle. The walk took the better part of the morning. The mist followed her like a companion, rising and falling with the shape of the hills. As she moved deeper into the trees, the sounds of the world changed. No birdsong here, only the faint rustle of branches, the creak of damp roots adjusting, and the soft thud of her boots on moss. When she arrived at the clearing, she stood at its edge, not stepping in immediately. There was a rule, unspoken but known. You did not enter the circle without purpose. She reached into her pouch and removed 3 berries. One by one, she placed them on the stones closest to her, murmuring a word with each. Not a name, not a prayer, just sounds low and slow that vibrated in her throat and seemed to sink into the moss. Then she entered. She walked the circle clockwise once, her hand brushing the tops of the stones as she moved. Each felt different. One warm from a sliver of sunlight, another damp and cold. One buzzed faintly beneath her fingers, like a distant memory trying to speak. She knelt at the center and lit the candle. Its flame did not flicker, though the breeze moved gently around her. She placed the bone comb beside it, then began to hum. No words, just melody. Old and low, passed from throat to throat until it no longer needed language. This was not a ritual for the dead, nor a summoning of spirits. It was a conversation, one that could only be had with stillness, with time, and with care. She closed her eyes and listened. At first there was nothing. Then a soft shift, like the weight of air changing just the way a room feels just before a storm. She breathed in deeply, letting her lungs fill with the scent damp earth and old stone. The forest remembered. She thought of the names never written, of the lives never carved into wood or stone, of the healers, watchers, menders who came before her. Their hands, their tools, their secrets passed not through books, but through action, quiet gestures, habits, songs. She thought of the women who stirred cauldrons not for spells, but for soup, who wove nettle into thread that would outlast seasons, who read the sky without needing stars. These were her people, though she had never met them. And in that stillness, with the candle burning low, she felt not alone. When the wick finally reached its end, the wax puddled into the moss and hissed faintly. The spell, if it could be called that, was over. Not broken, simply done. She gathered her things without a word, left the comb where it lay, and walked the circle one last time, this time widdershins, counterclockwise, to close the loop, to give thanks, to step back. The mist had begun to lift by the time she reached her hut. The sun showed only faintly through thin clouds, like a face behind frosted glass. She hung her shawl near the hearth and tended the fire, then turned to a small bundle near her shelves, dried willow bark, some curled mint leaves, and a strip of linen. Her hands moved without instruction. She crushed the bark, added the mint, and folded the herbs into the linen, tying it with red thread, a poultice for the aching knees. Not dramatic, not mystical, just useful. Because survival was not a single grand act. It was the layering of small things, a stone placed right, a note hummed true, a meal made simple, a poultice wrapped tight. And as night approached, Merelda sat beside the fire and watched the candle she had lit that morning in the stone circle slowly fade. There would be more rain soon, more signs, more listening, but for tonight, the forest had spoken, and she had heard. The moon rose swollen and low that night, trailing ribbons of cloud behind it like a veil drawn across the stars. Its pale light washed the trees silver, casting long, blurred shadows across the moss-laden earth. In her hut, Merelda slept lightly, though not uneasily. Her dreams had returned, not sharp like before, but stretched and distant, as if viewed through the bottom of a glass bowl. She woke before dawn, as always, when the world was still cloaked in a hush too deep for birdsong. Her breath left faint clouds in the cool air. The fire had burned low, a bed of faint coals glowing like forgotten jewels. She stoked it gently, placing a few birch curls and a dry spruce bough over the embers. The fire responded like an old friend, rising slowly, blinking into life. There was something different in the air this morning, not in scent or temperature, but in stillness, a kind of pause before something unknown. Merelda had lived through enough seasons to know that silence, when too perfect, carried meaning. She wrapped herself in the twilight-dyed shawl and stepped outside, her boots crunching softly on the thawing ground. Mist clung to the underbrush like spider silk, and high in the trees, she heard the slow drip of melted frost falling from branch to branch. She did not go to the garden. Instead, she walked the narrow path that led around the slope of the hill toward the west-facing ridge. This trail was not one she walked often. It was steeper, less certain, and overgrown in places. But it led to a place she had visited only once the year before, an old charcoal pit, long since abandoned. Charcoal burning had once been a quiet craft of the deep forest, a way of turning slow work into hot promise. Men would stack logs in tight circles, cover them with turf and earth, then ignite the core and let it smolder for days. The fire burned inward, starving for air but never quite dying, until what remained was black, dense, and potent. Now only the ringed outline remained, a scar on the forest floor, moss creeping inward, but the scent, faint, smoky, still lingered. Merelda crouched at its edge and touched the soil. Warm. She blinked, sat still, then pressed her hanker into the ash. There, again, heat. Not the kind left behind from years past. This was recent, perhaps 2 days, maybe less. She looked around, listening. Nothing. No birds, no steps. Just the soft sigh of wind through pine needles. Someone had been here. She found no footprints. The ground had dried too quickly from the last rain. But she saw a broken sprig of fir, a stone overturned beside the ring. Subtle, intentional. Merelda stood slowly, feeling a prickle up her spine. Not fear exactly, but awareness. It had been years since she'd seen another soul in these woods, without their name arriving first in a whisper or dream. She returned home before the sun cleared the ridge. Once inside, she set her kettle to boil, but her movements were slower, measured. She pulled an old pouch from a high shelf, hidden behind bundles of dried sage and goosefoot. Inside were 7 dried leaves, deep green, almost black, pressed flat like parchment. Bear's foot, not a common herb, not one she used often. It was not for healing, it was for sensing. She crushed a single leaf between her fingers and dropped it into a clay cup, poured water just shy of boiling, waited. As it steeped, a bitter scent filled the room, smoke and soil and something faintly sweet like bruised thyme. She drank half, no more. Then she sat, spine straight, hands on her knees, and closed her eyes. The bear's foot tea did not bring visions. It did not cloud the mind. It cleared it. As if wiping fog from glass. Sounds sharpened. The crackle of the fire. The distant groan of a tree shifting in the wind. Her heartbeat, slow, steady. And beneath it all, something else. Not a presence, but an impression. Like someone watching not from outside, but just beneath the skin of the world. Merelda opened her eyes. The light had shifted. Not much, but enough. She poured the rest of the tea into the fire. A gift. A gesture. She was not alone, and the forest had chosen not to hide it. That evening she prepared as she had not done in years. She mixed powdered mushrooms with beeswax and pine pitch, forming small pellets and sealing them in waxed linen. Not for medicine, for barter. She bound her herbs tighter, stored the water jars deeper in the earth. She unhooked her grandmother's sickle from the beam above the door, cleaned it, wrapped the blade in cloth, and placed it behind the hearth. By the time night arrived, the stars were sharp and too many to count. Merelda lit no torch. She sat by the window and watched the trees sway in the wind, their black silhouettes like dancers without music. Someone was coming. Not now, not tonight, but soon. And whether they brought trouble, truth, or something else entirely, she would be ready. Because in the old ways, one did not fear the unknown. One met it with both eyes open, hands steady, and a fire waiting. The next day dawned slow and amber, the kind of light that settled gently on everything it touched. Dew clung to every blade of grass like 1,000 tiny lanterns, flickering in the soft sun. The sky stretched clear above the canopy, no longer heavy with mist or mood. It was a false peace, the sort of brightness that came not as comfort, but as a veil. Merelda knew it the moment she stepped outside. The forest was still too quiet, not silent, but cautious, as if it too was waiting. She did not tend the garden that morning, nor did she walk her usual path to the stream. Instead, she sat on the low stone wall beside her hut, sharpening her knife with a smooth river rock. Not for protection, not yet, but for readiness. The knife was old, its handle wrapped in hide so worn it had fused with the wood. It was not a weapon. It was an extension of her, used more for shaping roots than cutting flesh. But like all tools, it could speak in many languages when needed. As the blade whispered against stone, she listened, not to sound, but to absence. No bird song, no scurry of squirrel feet across the branches. Even the bees, on warmer days always early to rise, had not stirred. Something had entered the forest, not a beast that would have made noise. No, this was human. Merelda wrapped the blade in a strip of cloth soaked in oil of comfrey and stored it in the satchel she always kept within reach. Then she gathered her walking stick and stepped onto the north trail, the one she rarely used. It led toward the old path, the trade route that had once carried wagons and boots through the valley, back when kingdoms traded more than whispers. The path had long since been reclaimed by trees, but pieces remained. A broken wheel half buried in moss, a rusted hinge from a forgotten gate, and somewhere near its curve, an old watchstone, a tall pillar with markings that no one remembered how to read. Merelda reached the stone just past midday. The forest opened around it like breath held too long. Sunlight dappled the clearing, and the stone itself stood pale and worn, with only faint lines etched into its body. But the ground around it had changed. Tracks, not of deer, not wild boar, but boots, 3 sets, one larger, one light and uneven, the third dragging slightly. She crouched, pressing 2 fingers into the prints. Fresh. The soil still soft. They had passed through perhaps a half day before. She looked closer. Not just boots. Marks of weight, carrying something. A cart, perhaps, with wooden wheels that cut narrow lines into the mud. But there were no goods spilled, no animal droppings, no sign of trade. Not merchants, not pilgrims, something else. She stood and looked to the north, where the trail narrowed between 2 stones leaning like shoulders. Beyond that lay the outer forest, the old borderlands where fewer people walked. It was not her place to follow, not yet. So she returned the way she came, eyes sweeping the underbrush, fingers trailing along low branches, noting what had been disturbed. Back at the hut, she set to work in silence, not hurried, but efficient. She boiled water and added dried meadowsweet, sage, and a pinch of ground bark. Not for illness, for clarity. She drank it slowly while arranging her herbs in a new pattern on the shelf, defensive to the left, restorative to the right. A habit learned in youth from a teacher whose name she could no longer recall, only the shape of her smile. She took down a bundle wrapped in green cloth. Inside were strips of birch bark etched with charcoal symbols, protection marks, call signs, memory prompts. She selected one bearing the shape of a closed eye inside a crescent and nailed it to the inside of her door. Not because she was afraid, because she was awake. That night the wind picked up. It moved in wide arcs across the treetops, brushing the walls of her hut with long open palms. Merelda sat at the hearth, her spindle in hand, though she did not spin. She only held it, thumb running over its worn edge. Then, near midnight, came the knock. Not loud, not rushed, just two soft raps. She rose, unlatched the door, and opened it slowly. There stood a man, tall, wrapped in a faded traveling cloak stained with mud. His hair was the color of ash, pulled back and tied with twine. His face was lean, lined, but his eyes were what struck her. Not with fear, but with knowing. They held the weight of many roads, and they met hers not as a question, but as a mirror. Behind him, a child, barely walking age, bundled in wool too large for her frame, clutching a doll made of sticks and dried corn husks. Merelda said nothing. The man bowed his head once. "May we rest by your fire?" he asked, voice low and worn. She stepped aside. They entered, and she closed the door behind them. No questions. Not yet. She ladled soup from the kettle and placed it in their hands. The child ate slowly, eyes wide as if unsure it was not a trick. The man too ate, but with the restraint of one who had forgotten fullness. When they finished, the man looked at her, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "We have come far," he said. Merelda nodded. "And farther still to go." She said nothing. He set the bowl down gently. "But before we go, there are things you must know." Merelda sat, hands folded. She did not ask what. She only listened, because this was how stories always began, quietly, at night, beside a fire, between strangers who were not strangers at all, and the forest at last was listening again. The fire crackled softly, its light flickering across the walls, casting long shadows that swayed with the wind that sighed through the chimney flue. The man sat with his back straight, legs crossed. His cloak steamed lightly near the fire as the wet slowly seeped away. The child curled against him now, head resting on his side, eyes already closed. Her corn-husk doll held tight in one small hand. Merelda had placed a warm stone beneath a blanket for the child and laid a pinch of lavender near the hearth to lull sleep more gently. She moved with her usual grace, quiet, deliberate, and then sat across from the man, her hands wrapped around a wooden cup of nettle and lemon balm. She did not speak. The room was still. It was the man who broke the silence. "I knew your name before I reached this forest," he said, eyes fixed on the flames. "And yet I never heard it spoken in a tavern or printed in a ledger. It found me through stories, the kind whispered around cook fires and in the mouths of old women who remember more than they should." Merelda nodded once. That too was how she had learned names. "My name is Corin," he continued, "and the girl is Elna. She is not my blood, but she is mine all the same." Merelda's gaze shifted toward the child, then back to Corin. Still, she remained quiet. "We came from the lowlands," he said. "Not long ago there was a village there, Renwick, small, forgotten by kings and protected by rivers. We thought ourselves safe." He paused, his hand unconsciously reaching toward his satchel, then drawing back. It began with a tremor, not in the earth, but in the animals. The dogs stopped barking. The goats refused the path to water. The birds flew in crooked lines. We thought it a storm coming. He took a slow breath. But storms do not come in silence. What came without wind, without warning. A hush so complete it made the trees feel dead. And then the sickness. Merelda's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. She said nothing, but the movement was enough. Corin continued. It did not strike like fever. There was no cough, no sweat, only the stillness. One by one, people ceased to wake, as if the night itself had claimed them. No struggle, no cry. His voice grew softer, almost reverent in its restraint. "We buried them deep, but the ground we covered would not stay still. The next morning, the graves were empty. Only the claws remained." A log in the fire cracked, sending a brief burst of sparks upward. The child stirred in her sleep but did not wake. Corin looked at Merelda then, truly looked. "You know what I mean to say, don't you?" Merelda did not flinch. She stared into the fire, her voice finally emerging, soft and low. Waking death. Corin exhaled. Yes. For a long time, neither spoke. The room grew warm, but the air between them remained taut, drawn like the string of a bow. You ran, she said finally, not as accusation, but as observation. I did, he admitted. When I found Elna alone, her family gone, I took her. I don't know why. Only that she looked at me with eyes that still remembered who they were. He lowered his gaze. We've been walking ever since. Merelda studied him. His hands, calloused and cracked, his boots split at the seams. The way he kept glancing at the door, not with fear, but with the weight of one who no longer trusted any place to be still for long. You brought it with you, she said quietly. Corin's head jerked up. No, it clings, she said, interrupting. Not like smoke, like shadow. It follows the living. It feeds on the forgetting. He was silent. She rose and walked to her shelves, took down a small jar filled with dull gray leaves, vervain dried under moonlight. She crushed a handful into a cloth pouch, added salt from the river caves, then twisted it tight with a silver thread. You'll wear this, and she must carry one too. She handed him the pouch. He took it as if it might burn him. This will not keep it away, she added, but it will slow its steps. He nodded, swallowing hard. And you? What will you do? Merelda looked toward the sleeping child, her expression unreadable. I will remember, she said. That is my task. She turned back to the hearth and took the kettle off the hook, pouring what remained of the nettle tea into 2 cups. One she placed in front of Corin, the other she held in both hands. You will stay the night, she said. Tomorrow you must choose your path. But tonight you must rest, and speak no more of death. It listens too well. Corin bowed his head. Thank you. Merelda did not reply. She sat quietly as the fire sank lower bay, and the night pressed its cool fingers against the window panes. Outside, the forest shifted, slowly, as if something old and forgotten had stirred in its sleep and turned once more beneath the roots. And within the walls of that small stone hut, 3 lives breathed in rhythm: an old healer, a haunted traveler, and a child who held too much silence in her bones. No magic words were spoken, no rituals performed. But in the deep hours of that night, as Merelda watched the flames dance their last, she whispered to the darkness a promise older than blood. You will not pass through here unseen. The wind stirred, the candle flickered, and the watch began. Dawn arrived without color. The sky held the hue of pewter, and the light that filtered through the trees was more shadow than illumination. The mist had returned, thicker this time, blanketing the forest in a shroud of soft gray that clung to every branch and stone. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel distant, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Inside the hut, the fire had burned down to a cradle of glowing coals. Merelda stirred from her sleep slowly, emerging not from dreams but from deep stillness. She did not rise immediately. She lay there listening, to the breath of the child, to the slow, heavy rustle of Corin as he shifted beneath the woolen blanket she had given him. The quiet was not peaceful. It was waiting. She sat up and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. Her bare feet touched the cold stone floor, grounding her fully in the world once more. Her eyes fell on the small bundle of herbs and salt that lay beside the hearth, the one meant for the girl. Merelda had placed it beneath the child's pillow in the night, a safeguard, a boundary. Corin was already awake, though his eyes were closed. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the blanket, as if anchoring himself to the present. You did not sleep, she said simply. I did not dream, he answered, his voice low and rough. That is not always a mercy, Merelda replied. He opened his eyes and sat up. Across the room, Elna remained curled beneath her covers, unmoving save for the slow rise and fall of her chest. Merelda moved to the table and began preparing the morning drink, chicory root ground fine and steeped in water with a sliver of honeycomb. A bitter brew to sharpen the senses. She handed a cup to Corin without a word. They sat in silence as the forest breathed around them. I thought I might feel safer here, Corin said after a long pause. But now, I'm not sure safety exists anymore, not like it did. Merelda sipped her drink. Safety never truly existed, only preparation, only awareness. He looked at her, eyes shadowed. And when preparation isn't enough, then we endure. She stood and turned toward the window, The mist pressed against the glass, dull and impenetrable. She could feel it. The presence, not outside exactly, but not far. Watching, as all old things did, patient and unblinking. We cannot stay long, Corin said, as though echoing her thoughts. Whatever is following us, if it senses rest, it will come closer. Merelda nodded. You must leave by nightfall. But the girl, she is strong, Merelda interrupted gently. But she is carrying something she does not yet understand, something that must not grow comfortable. Corin lowered his gaze. She barely speaks. Her silence may be her only defense, Merelda said. Words give shape to things. Sometimes it is better not to name what follows you. Elna stirred then, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Corin moved to her side, but Merelda held up a hand. Wait, she whispered. Elna sat up, eyes wide, unfocused. Her small hands reached out, not forward, but to her sides, as though searching for something that wasn't there. Then she turned her head and looked directly at the far wall. Merelda's breath caught. The wall held nothing. No markings, no windows, just stone and shadow. But Elna was seeing something. Her mouth opened and she whispered one word, barely more than breath. Below. Corin knelt beside her. What, Elna? What did you see? But the girl only blinked once and looked at him with sudden clarity, as if she had not spoken at all. Merelda approached. She placed her hand on the girl's forehead, then on her sternum. The warmth was there, the pulse of life. But beneath it, something else. A second rhythm, faint, inharmonious. She is not ill, Merelda murmured, but she is not untouched. She said below, Corin repeated. What does that mean? Merelda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped to the hearth and removed the iron pot hook from its place. Beneath it, hidden behind a loose stone, lay a narrow recess. She reached in and withdrew an old bundle wrapped in cloth the color of dry blood. She unwrapped it on the table slowly. Inside were three things: a disc of obsidian polished to a dark mirror shine, a strand of dried ivy knotted into 12 loops, and a small leather pouch sealed with wax. She placed the obsidian disc on the table and beckoned Elna to sit. The girl obeyed without hesitation. Merelda held the disc to her eye, turning it slightly so that the light from the coals reflected across its surface. Then she angled it toward Elna's face. For a long moment, the stone showed only her reflection. Then the surface shimmered, not like water, not like glass, but like breath on a cold blade. And there, just behind Elna's shoulder in the reflection, something moved. Not form, not shadow, but an absence. Corin leaned forward, eyes wide. What is that? He whispered. Merelda's face was still, but her voice held weight. It is what followed you. She covered the disc again and placed it back in the cloth, sealing it quickly. What does it want? Corin asked. It does not want, Merelda said. It echoes. It feeds on remnants, on places where grief has no shape. It cannot enter uninvited, but it seeps through cracks in memory, through silence, through the spaces between breath and thought. Corin held Elna close, his eyes full of firelight and fear. Can we escape it? Merelda said. But you can outwalk it, if you keep moving, if you do not rest too long in one place, if you remember who you are. She took the leather pouch, broke the wax seal, and spilled a fine white powder onto a square of cloth. She folded it tight and pressed it into Corin's hand. When the air turns warm without sun, when the silence rings louder than sound, sprinkle this into flame. It will show you which way not to go. He nodded slowly, his voice caught in his throat. Merelda turned back to Elna. You are not broken, she whispered, gently brushing the girl's hair from her forehead. You are marked, but you are still your own. Elna looked up at her, eyes clear and ancient. Thank you, the girl said softly. And for the first time, Merelda smiled, a small, sad smile, the kind reserved for those who carry things they never asked to bear. Outside, the wind shifted, the mist began to lift, and somewhere far beneath the soil, the roots of the forest stirred, listening, waiting, remembering. The morning passed in a blur of muted preparation. Merelda moved through her tasks with the kind of quiet resolve that came only from age and repetition. Her hands folded herbs into pouches, wrapped smoked meat in oiled cloth, and secured jars of dried berries into a narrow satchel woven from reeds and wool. She did not speak, and neither did Corin. There was nothing more to say. Elna sat near the hearth, her small hands now busy with the edge of the shawl Merelda had laid across her shoulders, tracing the fibers like one might read the lines of a story. Her eyes no longer darted, no longer distant, They were watchful now, present. But underneath that presence ran a silence so deep, Merelda knew it would not be easily undone. By midday, the light had grown golden, slanting in long shafts through the trees, cutting across the hut's stone floor in narrow lines. Outside, the wind had shifted again, this time from the east, carrying with it the faint scent of thawed earth and sap. A change not just in weather, but in rhythm. Merelda handed Corin the satchel without ceremony. "Go west," she said. "Follow the stream until you see birch and threes. There will be a cut in the ridge, hidden, narrow. Few walk it, fewer remember it." Corin took the satchel, slinging it over his shoulder, his jaw set with the kind of tension that comes not from fear, but from the weight of needing to appear unafraid. "I'll protect her," he said. Merelda nodded. "You must do more than that. You must remind her, every day, of who she is and what is hers. The thing that follows you, it feeds on forgetting." He looked down at Elna. She had risen now, standing by the doorway, her small hand gripping the cornhusk doll, the shawl trailing behind her like a mantle. She looked not like a child, but like a sentinel. As Corin opened the door, a gust of wind swept in, stirring the herbs hanging above the threshold. Their rustling sounded almost like whispers, soft, fleeting, gone. Merelda reached into the pouch at her waist and removed a thin strip of linen inked with symbols so faint they could barely be seen. She placed it into Elna's hand. "For dreams," she said. "Place it under your pillow. Let it catch what you cannot carry." Elna looked up at her and whispered, "Will you still be here when we come back?" The question was not innocent, not naive. It was ancient. Merelda knelt slowly, bringing her eyes level with the child's. "If I am not," she said, "then the forest will remember me, and that will be enough." They left just before the sun reached its peak. No goodbyes, only a final glance, Corin once over his shoulder, Elna one long look until the trees swallowed them whole. Merelda stood in the doorway until she could no longer hear their steps. Then she turned back inside and closed the door. Alone again, but not empty. She went to the hearth and swept the ashes into a clay bowl. She carried them to the small altar behind her shelves, a flat stone upon which sat 4 small objects, a dried sprig of yew, a crow's feather, a fragment of antler, and a piece of smoothed quartz. To this, she added the ash, a mark of what had passed through, of the fire shared, of the bond forged. She sat by the fireless hearth and let the stillness gather around her. The hut was quieter now, but not lifeless. There was a presence in the air, one she had felt many times before. Not fear, not sorrow, something older. Expectation. Outside, the birds had returned. A pair of robins chirped in the brush. A squirrel chattered from a branch. But there was a tension in the noise, a nervous melody. And then, as the sun dipped lower, a sound. Not sharp, not sudden. A thud from beneath the hut. Merelda did not move. Another thud, slow, hollow, as though something pressed against the earth from below. Not clawing, pressing. She stood and crossed the room to the rug by the hearth. Beneath it, the old trapdoor, a cellar, though not for food, for memory. She lifted the rug, revealing the iron ring set into the stone. She gripped it, felt the cold bite into her skin and pulled. The door opened with a groan, exhaling dust and a breath of cold earth. She lit a small torch and descended the worn stone steps. The cellar was round, carved from the bedrock generations ago. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with jars, scrolls, bones, and tools wrapped in cloth and string. In the center stood a basin, carved from a single block of black stone. Merelda stepped toward it. Inside, the water was still, perfectly still. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a vial of the white powder she had given Corin. She let a single pinch fall into the water. It swirled, then cleared, and the reflection it revealed was not hers. It was a forest, twisted, sunless, the trees bare and wrong. A figure stood among them, tall, thin, without face or shadow, watching. Merelda inhaled once, steady. "You found them," she whispered. The image shimmered, and the basin turned black again. She turned away, climbing the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. At the top, she closed the trapdoor, replaced the rug, and sat once more by the hearth. Night came quickly. She lit no fire. Instead, she watched the darkness gather around her. And as she closed her eyes, she whispered not a prayer, but a message, carried in the silence to those still walking. Remember who you are, and walk faster than the dark. Night settled in layers, first as shadow, then as silence, and finally as a kind of presence. The kind that crept beneath doors and through the tiny spaces between stones, curling around the ankles of chairs, slipping into the folds of blankets. It did not speak. It did not threaten. It simply was, and in being, it demanded awareness. Merelda did not light a flame. She sat in the dark, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes closed but not asleep, her ears strained toward the forest, toward the earth below, toward the places her sight could not reach. In her youth, she had feared the dark, not because of what it hid, but because of what it revealed, about herself, her memories, the long line of silence from which she had come. Now she welcomed it, because in darkness there were fewer lies. The sound came again, faint, but nearer. Not from the cellar this time, from the trees, not footsteps, no crunch of leaves or crack of twig, but something moving nonetheless, a shift of weight, a brushing of low branches, the sound of stillness being peeled away. She rose and crossed to the window. Beyond the glass, the forest stood like a black tapestry, velvet and still. The trees, tall and unmoving. The path where Corin and Elna had disappeared was hidden by the curve of the hill. There was nothing to see, and yet she felt it. Something watched, something learned. Merelda returned to the center of the room and knelt beside the hearth. She laid her palms flat on the stone floor, whispering a single word, low, shaped by the back of her throat. The word was not a call, it was an invitation. The temperature dropped almost immediately, the air thickened, and in the silence something stirred. Not in the hut, not in the trees, but in memory. She saw her mother's hands weaving threads soaked in ash water, binding it into loops and knots across a doorway. She saw her grandmother dipping a brush made from pine needles into black sap, drawing symbols along the inner rim of a cooking pot. She saw herself, young, too young, learning the difference between a dream and a warning. The lesson had never left her. She pulled a bundle of dried tansy from the wall and crumbled it into a clay dish, added wormwood, salt, and the shavings of a candle once lit during a burial. She ground them together with a pestle, slowly, letting the scent rise into the room like a bitter incense. When the mixture was ready, she carried it outside into the night. The air met her like water, dense, pressing. She walked the perimeter of her home, fingers trailing against the walls, scattering the ash mixture as she moved. It left no visible trail, but it etched itself into the space between the world she lived in and the one that watched from just beyond. As she passed the hawthorn tree at the edge of the clearing, she paused. It had changed, not visibly, but she could feel it. The bark no longer pulsed with the same quiet strength. The buds on its branches, once tight and eager, now seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether they still wished to bloom. She placed her hand against the trunk. "What do you remember?" she whispered. The wind shifted, and the leaves, though still bare, rustled softly. She stood there a while longer, eyes closed, listening. The wind did not carry voices, but it carried feeling, and the feeling was clear. Something was coming that did not belong to any one season. It belonged to forgetting, to the dark that eats the name of a place, the shape of a face, the thread of a story. She returned inside and closed the door behind her, sealing it with a twist of iron wire through the latch. She brewed a tonic, valerian, skullcap, wild lettuce, enough to pull her just below the surface of sleep, but not deep enough to drown. She needed to dream now, and she needed to dream clearly. When the drink was ready, she lay on her bed, the hearth dim behind her, the air still carrying the scent of wormwood and ash. Sleep came slowly, but when it arrived, it opened wide. She stood in a forest not her own. The trees were too tall, their branches like arms folded across the sky. The leaves did not rustle. The ground was soft, too soft, as though made of cloth soaked in memory. In the distance, she saw a shape. It moved not like a man, not like a beast, but like absence given form. Every step it took left nothing behind, no bent grass, no echo. Even the light seemed to retreat from its edges. She did not run. She stood her ground, and as it approached, she lifted her hand and whispered the same words she had spoken to the stones earlier that day. The thing paused, its head, or what served as a head, tilted, and then from within it, a sound. Not speech, not growl, but a voice she had known once, her father's, whispering the first song he ever sang to her when she was a child. Her body shivered. It was not mimicry, it was memory. It had taken his voice. Merelda opened her eyes with a gasp. The room was cold. the fire dead, but she was no longer uncertain. This thing, whatever it was, did not kill in rage. It collected stories, names, fragments of people, held them in silence until they faded from all but the earth. It was not here to destroy, it was here to erase. She stood and walked to her writing shelf, pulled out her scrolls, her ink, her fine hair brush, and she began to write. Every name she remembered, every place, every ritual, every sign. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes blurred, because now she knew, to survive, she would need to do more than remember. She would need to make remembering unbreakable. And before this was over, the forest would have to speak louder than the thing that had come to silence it. By the second day, the light had changed. It no longer poured from the sky, but crept, thin and strained, through a high veil of clouds that never quite moved. Everything beneath it wore a kind of washed pallor, as though the colors of the world had been gently wrung out and hung to dry in some place just beyond reach. The green of the moss seemed dimmer, the bark of the trees grayed, and even the smoke from Merelda's chimney curled upward with less conviction. She had not slept again. Not truly. What rest she'd found had been shallow, adrift somewhere between the outer edge of waking and the deeper fold of dream. In those few stolen hours, her mind had given her images, not words. A bell tied to a broken branch, a river running backward through a field of bones, a child's toy slowly turning to ash in a basin of water. Signs, echoes, symbols. Merelda knew how to read such things, but even she had never seen dreams so tightly woven with silence. She rose and prepared a tea of marshmallow root and angelica, grounding herself with warmth. As she drank, she stared into the fire, feeling its heat, but sensing no comfort. The hut, for all its age and memory, no longer felt like shelter. It was a container, a skin stretched over breath, something waiting to be pierced. By mid-morning, she gathered her cloak and stepped outside. The forest greeted her with a stillness that felt unnatural. The birds had not returned. The wind, though present, did not carry scent. It was as if the land itself had swallowed its voice. She made her way to the edge of the clearing where the hawthorn tree stood. Its buds had stopped growing. The change was subtle, but she noticed. What had once been the promise of green now sat hesitant, withdrawn, like something reconsidering its own birth. She placed a hand on the trunk. "You remember me?" she whispered. "But do you still believe?" The tree gave no reply, but its bark, warm in all seasons, now felt cool beneath her fingers. She turned and began her walk toward the western ridge, the place where Corin and Elna had passed days before. The forest had swallowed their trail as expected. No footprints, no broken brush, but she knew the way, not by memory, but by feeling. Her staff tapped against the stones as she descended into the shaded hollows. Here, the light barely reached the floor. Moss grew thick on everything, rocks, logs, even living trees. The silence was deeper here, so deep it buzzed faintly in her ears. It took her an hour to reach the river fork. There, by the water's edge, stood a circle of stones, not large, no taller than her knee, covered in lichen. The kind of thing most would overlook, but not Merelda. She had built them herself years ago, when she still believed such things could bind the old paths shut. She crouched beside them now and saw what she feared. The center stone had fallen. Not by wind, not by age. It had been moved. Something had passed through. She leaned forward and placed her ear to the stone. Silence, but not absence. There was a pressure there, just beyond hearing, like standing near a great bell just after it had been struck, and feeling the last shiver of its voice pass through the bones. She took a small blade from her belt and pricked her thumb. One drop of blood she pressed to the stone. It sizzled faintly as though the stone had been holding a breath. Then she whispered, "Not yet," and the stone grew cool again. As she rose to her feet, the wind changed. It came from the east now, carrying something new, a sound. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Laughter, childlike, echoing through the trees as if caught in a hollow branch. Not Elna's, no. This laughter was wrong. It did not rise from joy or surprise. It rose like steam from rock, from places deep and sour. Merelda turned toward the sound, eyes narrowing. It was moving, circling, searching. She did not follow. Instead, she walked the long way home, crossing the old stone bridge over the ravine, where water still trickled through the mossy dark. She left a charm there, oak leaf bound in thread, dipped in wax, pressed between river stones, a message, a warning. By the time she returned to the hut, the light was nearly gone, though the sun had not yet set. Inside, she pulled her scrolls from the table and unfurled the parchment. The ink had faded. Not all of it, just the names. The names she had written in the night. Her grandmother's, her father's, the old women of the valley, the midwife who had once taught her to find heartbeat in silence. Gone. Erased clean. As if never written. Merelda's hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. Because now she understood. It was not enough to remember. This thing, whatever it was, it unwrote. Not just bodies, not just places, but memory itself. It had touched the ink, or the page, or her. She lit a fire and burned the scrolls, one by one, watching the smoke rise and curl into the rafters. Then she sat in the middle of the room, laid her hands flat on the ground, and began to speak. Not aloud, not with breath, but with memory. She recited the names in her mind again and again, pressing each into her bones, not into ink, not into stone, but into herself. Because if it could erase what was written, then she would become the page, and she would not be so easily burned. The wind changed again that night. It crept through the trees with a whisper not quite carried, but felt like cold breath against the nape of the neck. There were no stars overhead, only a deep, thick velvet sky. Even the moon had hidden itself, and the hut beneath the hawthorn tree sat as a shadow within shadows. Inside, Merelda prepared a circle. She moved slowly with purpose, laying dried mugwort in a ring along the stone floors, tracing over it with threads of wool soaked in ash water. Around the edge she placed 9 stones, each taken from a different place in the valley: river, forest, hill, glade, grave, garden, gate, and glen. Each had once belonged to someone. Each held memory, not symbols, not wards, anchors. This night she would not watch, she would not ward, she would walk. Dream walking was not something Merelda did lightly. It had cost her days before, pieces of herself she never quite recovered, memories gone fuzzy at the edges, fingers that no longer held warmth, the inability to recall her brother's face without looking at the one carved on her hearthstone. But this night was not for keeping safe. It was for knowing. Because what erased the world had already begun to erase her. And before it did, she needed to see where it slept. She wrapped a strip of yew bark around her left wrist and drank from the dream vessel, an iron cup steeped with poppy, blue lotus, and a sliver of obsidian. She lay back in the circle and let her breath slow, her hands open, palms up, her spine flat to the earth beneath the stones. As the herbs took hold, the firelight dimmed, not with the waning of flame, but as though distance had crept between her and everything it touched. The world thickened, colors bleeding at the edges, sounds blurring into a hum. And then the circle opened. She stood barefoot in snow, though the sky above her bled twilight. The trees around her were wrong, too tall, too thin, their bark slick and black like oil. Where leaves should have been, there hung rags of something between skin and silk, twitching though no wind stirred. Beneath her feet, the snow was not snow, it was ash, still warm. She walked forward. Her feet did not sink. There were no tracks behind her, no birds, no beasts, only the sound, soft, rhythmic. A child's lullaby, sung in a voice too old. She followed it, through twisted trunks and hollow groves, past stones marked with symbols she did not recognize, though something in her bones remembered them. Each step she took, the air grew heavier, her limbs thicker with a weariness that wasn't hers. It was borrowed, inherited. She came to a clearing, at its center, a pool, black, still, but reflecting nothing. Surrounding it were statues, tall, like human in shape, but melted at the edges, as if they had once been true and had begun to forget themselves. And kneeling at the edge of the water was a figure, child-sized, wrapped in the same shawl she had given Elna. Merelda's heart tightened. Elna? She called, not aloud, but within the dream, where intention traveled faster than voice. The figure turned, and it was not Elna. It had no face, only a mouth sewn shut with thread. The shawl burned away as she looked, and in its place was a skin of bark and soot and names, so many names, scratched in lines too fine to read, names being erased one by one. As she watched, her own name began to form at the base of its jaw. She reached for it, and the pool began to boil. The statues twisted toward her, not in anger and hunger, not to consume her flesh, but her lineage, her stories, her place in time. She ran, not from fear, from purpose, because now she knew this place was not a realm. It was a wound, a hollow in the world where all forgotten things went to be buried in silence, and the creature at its center was not a beast or a god. It was absence made alive, and it wanted her not dead. It wanted her unwritten. As she reached the edge of the forest, a hand caught her ankle, not pulling her down, pulling her back. She turned, and there, rising from the ash, was a figure, human, solid. Her mother, eyes dark with sorrow. "You must not stay," the figure said, voice layered with years Merelda had never lived. "If you look too long," the voice whispered, "you forget what you were." Merelda screamed, not in pain but to remember, and woke. Back in the circle, sweat soaked her clothes, blood ran from her nose, her eyes stung with salt and smoke. But she was alive. The fire was out. The ash ring was broken, but her name remained. She staggered to her feet and reached for the spindle on the shelf, the one with her grandmother's etchings. She would spin. Tonight, not wool, but remembrance. She would twist her own stories into thread, because now she understood. Ink could fade, stone could break, thread remembered the hand that spun it. And as long as that hand lived, the past could be stitched back into the world. The morning after the dream walk arrived, pale and trembling, as though the sky itself had witnessed too much. The light that filtered through the trees came not with warmth, but with a cautious, diluted gold, as if it feared disturbing what the night had left behind. Merelda sat near the hearth, her limbs still heavy with the memory of ash and forgetting. Her hands shook, not with weakness, but with the residue of something deeper, proximity to the place where stories went to die. She had not spoken since waking. There were no words left in her throat, only fragments of song, the last echoes of her mother's warning, and the stitched names scratched into the dream's skin. She had seen her own name halfway written there, and she had come back. That alone was victory. Now she had work to do. She unwrapped the spindle from the linen it had rested in for years. The wood felt dry but alive beneath her fingertips. Carved from dogwood, it bore 7 symbols down its stem, each one an emblem of a memory passed through the hands of women who spun not for beauty or barter, but to preserve. Spinning, in its oldest form, was not just craft. It was tethering, a way of binding a name to the world, of keeping a soul visible to the land even after the voice had gone. Merelda gathered flax, not from her storage shelf, but from a hidden bundle in the rafters, fibers soaked long ago in wine, moonlight, and the tears of the last woman she had midwifed. The child had not lived, but the name had. That was the point. She sat by the window, letting the pale light fall across her lap. She twisted the flax slowly, deliberately, feeding it into the spindle's whorl, letting the thread grow tight and strong. And as she spun, she spoke, each word a name, each name a life, each life a stitch. Isla, daughter of Heron, midwife, firekeeper, bone reader. Tomel of the Blue Grove, maker of nets, broke bread with crows. Ephron, who sang the ash trees awake. The names came not from memory alone, but from bone and marrow, from dreams and lessons passed hand to hand in silence. They were names the world had long since stopped repeating, but she had carried them unknowingly like seeds. She spun for hours. When her fingers cramped, she paused only to drink water, to chew a root for strength. Then she continued. The thread gathered in a soft pile in her lap, pale and glowing faintly in the muted light. But it was more than fiber. It was continuity. By midday, she had spun enough for 9 loops. She braided them into a length no longer than her arm, then hung it across her hearth, above the cold coals, between the hooks where she once hung herbs. There it would catch the air of every word spoken in the room. It would absorb memory and hold it. She would make more, dozens, hundreds if time allowed, because now she knew how to resist, not by fighting, but by remembering harder than the forgetting could swallow. Still, the air that clung to the cabin walls was uneasy. Outside, the forest had not yet returned to itself. The birds did not sing. The bees remained hidden. Even the wind moved strangely, gusting in sharp angles rather than flowing as it should. That evening, Merelda sat outside beneath the hawthorn tree. She brought with her a single candle and a strip of leather wrapped around a sliver of bone. It had belonged to her brother. He had died before the first frost of her 20th year, taken by fever so sudden it left no mark, only absence. She had not spoken his name in 20 years. Now she did. "Jalen," she whispered, "you are not gone. You are still mine." She tied the strip of leather to the branch of the hawthorn. The candle flickered, and for a breath, the wind stilled. A promise. That was all she needed. She returned to her hut and lit a small flame in the hearth, not for heat, but for presence. The thread above the mantle turned slowly in the rising warmth. It moved like a compass needle, steadying. Outside, something passed through the trees. Merelda felt it, not with her skin, but with her thread. It paused just at the edge of the clearing, then turned away. The first name had been enough. Tomorrow, she would spin more, because she had begun to understand the thing fully now. It fed on forgetting, yes, but more than that, it feared pattern, rhythm, repetition, song. It could unmake written words, it could erase stones and scrolls, but it could not untwist a name spun into thread, sung over fire, and hung in the breath of a living voice. It was too old for that, too far from the loom. And Merelda, she had begun to spin the loom back into the world. The next morning arrived not with sunrise, but with a hush, a deeper quiet than before, as if the world was holding its breath, watching her. Merelda woke slowly, her limbs heavy, not from sleep, but from what she had carried the day before. Her dreams had been strange, not terrifying, but wide. She had wandered landscapes that did not belong to this earth, great stone rings standing in oceans of grass, staircases that led not upward but into the sky itself, voices speaking in reverse, repeating her name as though afraid it might dissolve. But she woke with it still on her lips, her name, still intact, still hers. She rose and washed her hands in rainwater caught the night before, letting it run over her fingers and into the small basin that sat by the hearth. Water held memory, she knew, but only if asked to. So she spoke a quiet word as she poured, hold. Then she began the day's work. She spun again, this time a darker thread, soaked first in boiled walnut husks to deepen its tone, for contrast, for layering, for anchoring memory not only in light, but in shadow. Because some names were not joyful, some were whispered at the edges of grief, tied to loss and longing. They deserved remembrance too. As she spun, she thought of those names, the ones not spoken often, the ones even the forest had begun to forget. There was Brenna, the silent girl who had watched stars as though they could speak. Merelda had found her once in the hollow tree by the old path, humming to herself, hands filled with blue stones. She had vanished before winter. And Dren, the boy who'd carried messages between villages, fleet of foot, always grinning, even in the rain. He'd been taken in the season of failed harvests. They had buried his boots when no body returned. And Reyna, Merelda's cousin, born too soon, never walked, but laughed more deeply than anyone Merelda had ever known. She had lived for only 3 summers, but her name, her laugh, it had held weight. Merelda wove their names into the new thread, her fingers aching from the tight spin, her back stiff, her breath slow and steady. By midday, she had created 3 more braids. These she did not hang above the hearth. These she buried, one beneath the hawthorn tree, one at the corner of the garden where the wild fennel grew, and one at the threshold of her hut, tucked deep beneath the stone slab that bore the weight of every step she took into the world. Not offerings, not protections, reminders. At dusk, she lit no lamp. She sat in the fading light, her hands resting on her knees, and listened. The forest had begun to change, not with noise, but with attention. Something was moving, not closer, but differently, slower, as if uncertain. It had noticed her resistance, it had tasted her defiance, and now it lingered at the edges, no longer confident it could consume her whole. But still, it waited, because forgetting is patient, and every breath the living take draws them a little closer to sleep, to silence, to the thinning of memory. Merelda stood. She took a small drum from beneath her bed, a frame of bent ash wood, a stretched skin across its surface. She had not played it in years. She placed it in her lap and began to strike, softly at first. Not for rhythm, for recollection. Each beat marked a name, a place, a meal shared under a storm, a kiss behind the yew tree, a broken cup that had once been her mother's favorite. She did not speak as she played. She remembered. And the drum answered her. Its voice echoed in the walls, in the floor, in the thread above the hearth, in the flame that did not burn but glowed from her center. The thing outside the clearing felt it. She could tell. Its edges blurred, its shape shifted, as if trying to become something she would not forget. But it couldn't, because she was spinning faster now, tighter, binding herself to the world, stitch by stitch, sound by sound, not with power, with presence. When the stars came out that night, dim, flickering but true, Merelda sat beside the hearth, watching the threads sway in the warm air, and whispered, "You may erase names from stone. You may unwrite ink, break scrolls, silence bells, but you cannot unspin me. I have spun myself into the breath of the forest, into the roots of the hawthorn, into the crack between heartbeat and silence." And she smiled faintly as the shadows outside stirred and turned, not away, but around, because now the thing that erased had learned something new. She could not be forgotten, not while her voice still moved through thread. By the time the 18th day broke, the air had changed. It no longer carried the heavy stillness of the nights before, nor the fragile silence that hovered like mist. Now it moved, slowly, deliberately, through the trees, threading itself between branches like a loom working without hands. It was not wind, it was motion with memory. Something that had heard Merelda's drum and had not left, but had begun to listen. Inside the hut, Merelda sat in front of the fire, which had long since burned to embers. She held a braid of thread between her hands, newly spun, still warm from her touch. It was pale gray, dyed with stone ash and steeped in meadowsweet, and knotted with the names of people not seen in decades. Some she had known, some only whispered to her in stories by those long buried. She placed the braid across her shoulders like a mantle, not for ceremony, for weight. Today, she would walk the ridge, not the low path where she had met Corin, not the trail by the river where she often gathered roots. She would climb to the high places where the land met the sky and memory held fast to the stones because it had nowhere else to go. The path to the ridge was narrow, winding through pine and rock, sometimes little more than a ledge, but Merelda's feet knew the steps, even if her bones protested. She moved with the slow determination of someone older than the hills, and yet more rooted than the youngest sapling. As she walked, she began to hum. It was not a song she had learned. It came to her as breath, shaped by footfall and heartbeat. A song of threading, of being threaded, of choosing not to forget. The ridge revealed itself just past midday, the trees thinning, the sky opening like a wound into pale blue. The wind here was sharper, touched by snow, still hidden in the creases of distant peaks. From this height, Merelda could see the whole of the valley, the curve of the river, the glint of her roof, the shape of the old charcoal pit beyond the trees. She sat on the highest rock, knees pulled to her chest, and unwrapped a cloth from her satchel. Inside was a single item, a spindle carved from antler, cracked but still whole. It had belonged to her mother. Merelda had never used it before. Some things were passed down not for use but for witnessing. But today she would spin with it, because today she needed more than thread. She needed a bridge between her and her mother, between her and the others, between the world that was and the one being pulled apart, thread, by something that wanted only quiet, only stillness, only absence. She pulled a length of fiber from her pouch, undyed, wild, tangled, and began, each twist a memory, each pull a breath. She felt the wind push against her back, not cruelly, but with urgency. It was gathering, around her, below, above, as if the ridge itself had begun to spin with her. The thread grew longer, and with it the horizon seemed to stretch. She saw things not visible to the eye, a line of children walking through forest paths never drawn on maps, an old woman standing on the edge of a field planting seeds that shimmered when touched by shadow, a man at a river whispering names into stones and letting them sink, memories, not hers, but hers to carry. The wind rose, and with it came the hum, not hers now, but echoed, low, layered, 1,000 voices behind her, around her, within her. She did not turn, she did not look, because to look would have ended it. She knew that. Instead, she spun faster, her fingers a blur. The spindle hummed, the thread shone, and when the final fiber slipped between her thumb and forefinger, sealing the braid, the voices fell silent, not gone, listening. She stood, braid in hand, and tied it to the branch of a gnarled pine growing sideways from the cliff. It fluttered in the wind like a signal, like a banner, like the breath of the land remembering its own name. Then she whispered one word, not into the wind, into the stone beneath her feet, a word that meant, "I see you." And the stone replied, not in language, but in settling, as if something beneath it had shifted and chosen for now to remain. She descended before the light could fade, each step down the ridge lighter than the last, not because the burden had passed, but because it had shared itself. And when she reached her hut once more, the thread above her heart had stopped moving. It hung straight, pulsing faintly in the darkening air. She smiled. The forgetting had not gone, but it had faltered, because now the ridge remembered too. And it would not be silent. That night the stars returned. Not bright, not many, but there, fragile glimmers like breath held in the lungs of the sky, blinking awake after too long a sleep. The forest, too, had begun to breathe again, though cautiously. A single owl called from the far trees. A moth beat against the window, drawn not by flame, but by the thread hanging still above the hearth, which now pulsed with something deeper than light. Merelda sat beside the fire, thread and spindle resting on her lap, her fingers stained with walnut and ash. The thread from the ridge, the one spun with her mother's spindle, was coiled neatly beside her, wrapped in linen and tied with a knot she had learned as a child, the knot of holding, the first of many. She did not sleep that night. She waited, because when the land begins to remember, so too do the things that feed on forgetting, and they come hungry. Sometime past the hour when the embers fall to quiet glow, the hut shifted. Not in the wood, not in the stone, as if something immense had stepped nearby without moving, folding the world just enough to slip through. Merelda did not rise. She did not need to. It had come to her. She reached for a bundle tucked beneath her bench. 9 braids of thread, each wound around a stone, each buried earlier that week and then exhumed by her own hands. They were no longer just thread. They were reminders, saturated with memory, soaked in the act of pulling the past forward into the breath of now. She placed them in a circle around herself and closed her eyes. And then it entered. There was no door opening, no creak on the threshold, but she felt it. First in her ears, a sudden quiet that rang like pressure dropped from the room, and then in her lungs, which strained against the thinness of the air. It smelled of old paper and burnt wick, of forgotten books and dried bones. It did not speak. It unspoke, and in its presence, her own memories began to flutter. The warmth of her mother's voice faded, the feel of her father's hand at the riverbank blurred. Even the thread in her fingers felt thinner, lighter, as though it too might dissolve. Merelda took a breath, not through her mouth, but from the soles of her feet, through the stone, through the ash beneath the hearth, through every root that remembered the first fire of the first home. She exhaled and began to hum. No words, just tone. The hum of the spindle turning, of her grandmother's breath while weaving, of bees moving through summer air thick with time. The thing inside the hut paused. She could feel it hesitate, not in fear, but in confusion. Sound was not memory, but it was close. And then, softly, she began to speak. She did not name herself. She named others. Farron, who sang the geese down in frost. Lila, who knew every knot by heart and finger. Nin, who walked backward through storms and never lost her path. Each name pressed back against the cold. Each name rebuilt the room. Her voice grew steadier, louder, until the pulse of her thread began to hum with her, a vibration, a spinning, a reclaiming. The air shifted again, the presence wavered, not leaving but unraveling like a knot undone from within. And then without sound, without breath, it pulled back, through stone, through night, leaving behind the scent of rain just mist. Merelda opened her eyes. The fire was out, but her thread still pulsed. She stood slowly, gathered the 9 memory stones, and placed them back into their bundle. Then she walked to the door and stepped outside. The trees were still, but awake. She walked barefoot into the clearing, lifted her hands and spoke to the darkness. You are not the only one who remembers how to unmake, but I have learned to reweave. She looked toward the ridge, where the thread fluttered in the night wind like a flame that did not burn, and she whispered, I will not let them be forgotten. And far, far beyond the forest's edge, the thing that erased turned slowly. It had heard, and it knew, for the first time in 1,000 years, that its work might not be easy. Not while one remained who could spin the past into thread strong enough to hold. The morning after was soft. Rain had come in the night, not a storm, but a steady weeping from the sky, the kind that nourishes roots without stirring wind. Merelda woke to its rhythm, a slow percussion on the roof, the gentle drip from the eaves. The air smelled of wet stone, lichen, and ashwood. The earth was drinking. She rose without hurry, her feet finding the familiar chill of the floor, her fingers brushing the rim of the hearth as she passed. The ashes there had settled in a quiet ring, the faintest shimmer of thread silver visible in their folds. She did not disturb them. Some shapes, once formed, were meant to be left untouched. She lit a single beeswax candle, not for light, but for witness. This day was not for defense, it was for binding. She pulled down the leather-bound satchel from the highest shelf. Inside were remnants, odds and ends of thread from years past, little curls of wool from each season's first shearing, seed husks wrapped in nettle string, a corner of an old linen apron worn by her mother, now faded to a pale whisper of green. Every piece had been kept for a reason she had not always remembered. Now she did. These were the pieces of proof, tangible fragments that still carried story in their fibers. They had survived years of silence. They had not been erased. She placed them on her table in neat rows and prepared the loom. It was not a large loom, just two upright branches lashed with sinew, a crossbar of hazelwood. Primitive to some eyes, but to hers, sacred. She had made it with her own hands decades ago after her first return from dreamwalking. A loom not to make garments, but to make remembrance cloth. This was her craft's highest form, thread spun from names, warp made of memory, weft carried on breath. She began the work in silence. Each pass of the shuttle drew not just fiber, but meaning. With every thread she spoke, not aloud, but through the tension in her fingers, the rhythm of her breath. It was not a tapestry of pictures. There were no trees, no stars, no wolves dancing on moonlit hills. There were only lines, angled, jagged, smooth, overlapping, patterns that did not speak to the eye but to the marrow. Each movement wove a layer of memory into the fabric. She wove the sound of her mother's laugh in the garden, the way her brother had always walked with one boot untied, the scent of fennel boiling over the hearth in the season of sickness, the way the hawthorn tree trembled when the first frost touched its roots. And in between she wove the silence, the holes where people had vanished, where houses had fallen, where songs had ended without the echo of a final note. The loom creaked softly, the candle burned low. Outside, the rain slowed. By midday, the first length of cloth was finished. It was not large, no more than the width of her shoulders and the length of her arm, but it pulsed, not with magic, with memory. She cut it free and placed it over her shoulders like a mantle. It felt heavier than it should, not in weight, in truth. As she stepped outside into the silver-washed light of the forest, she heard the quiet, not the absence of sound, but a deeper quiet, the hush of something listening, something waiting. She walked to the center of the clearing and raised her hands to the branches of the hawthorn tree. There, she tied one edge of the cloth to the limb, letting it hang like a banner caught in a wind too slow to be seen. The tree trembled, just once, and the sky grew very still. From the edge of the woods came a change. Not motion, not shadow, but pull, as if something in the world had leaned closer. She turned toward it, and for the first time she saw it. It did not wear a face, it wore absence. Its body was made of hollows, hollow of names, of places, of all that had been unloved and unsung and unremembered. Its form shifted like smoke, like ink dropped into milk, and yet there was gravity to it, a weight of forgotten years. It did not speak, it unspoke. And when its silence reached her, she felt her own name begin to waver at the edge of her mind. But the cloth held. The weight on her shoulders steadied her. The pattern in its weave pulsed against her skin, and in that rhythm, her name returned. Merelda, daughter of Ellis, singer of storms, spinner of thread that no knife could cut. She took a step forward. "You have no place here," she said. "Not because I bar the way, but because this place remembers." The creature's form flickered, as if the shape of her voice had wounded it. "You do not kill," she said. "You dissolve. You soak through cracks, but I have closed them, with story, with string." The wind shifted, and the absence pulled back. Not far, not fully, but like smoke from a flame that refused to die. She lowered her arms, let the cloth fall, and as she returned to her hut, she left it there, hanging, swaying in the air like a vow. Tonight she would spin again, and tomorrow she would weave. Because this was no longer about one woman, one hut, or even one forest. This was about remembering loud enough that even the oldest silence would have no choice but to listen. The 21st morning was colder than the ones before. The frost had returned, not heavy, not harsh, but quiet, tracing silver filigree across the windows and leaving the grass stiff and glistening. It was the kind of frost that came when the earth tried to remember its own hardness after too many days of softness. Merelda stepped outside barefoot, letting the chill bite at her soles, letting the cold remind her that she was still rooted in the living. The cloth still hung from the hawthorn branch. It had not moved in the night, not once, as if it too had been listening, holding itself still in the presence of something that passed nearby. Merelda studied it carefully. The weave had changed, not its shape, nor its thread, but the feel. There was more tension now, as though the cloth had absorbed something from the air, a memory not its own. She reached out, touched its edge, and in that moment she heard a voice. Not a whisper, not a word, a tone, low, drawn from some cavern beneath the skin of the world. It was the hum of something waking. She stepped back and lowered her hand. Whatever it was, it had seen the cloth, and it had marked her. Back inside, she moved with new precision. No panic, no rush, but an unshakable knowing. The work had to quicken now. She had felt it for days. The thing outside the clearing was not content to linger. It was searching, shifting, stretching toward the shape of what it once was before it was forgotten. And she had bought only time, not peace. She lit the fire, fed it cedar, and pulled a long bundle from beneath her cot. Inside, strands of wool untouched for years, yellowed, coarser, filled with brambles but strong. She would need it for what came next. Today she would spin the heart thread, the center of tapestry, the anchor. To do it, she needed to call upon something more than memory. She needed to draw on witness. So she opened the jar, a small lidded vessel made from river clay, sealed with wax and tied with a string of copper beads. It held 7 teeth, each one from a woman who had chosen to die with her name on her tongue rather than give it up to fear. The last gift of those who had remembered even through pain. She placed one tooth on the table, then another and another. 7 lives, 7 names. She lit 7 candles, and she began to spin. The fibers fought her at first. The old wool resisted, tangled, snapped. She cut her finger once, the blood beating quickly and falling into the mass of thread before she could stop it. But she did not clean it. She let it bind. Because the cloth needed to know cost, she sang as she worked. A song she had never been taught, but had always known. The kind sung by women who worked in silence too deep for words, who hummed to babies that never cried, who stitched the dead into the earth with fingers that could no longer tremble. She sang until her voice cracked. She spun until her arms ached. By dusk, the thread lay in a tight coil beside her, humming faintly. The sound of breath held in fabric, of promises not yet broken. She wrapped it in linen, placed it in her satchel, and stepped outside again. The forest was waiting, not menacing, not warm, just there, as if all of it had turned to face her. She walked east this time, toward the old stone wall where the land fell into a ravine and the trees grew thinner, older. The stones there had been placed before names had formed, rough, wide, covered in moss that refused to die even in winter. She found the gap in the wall, the one no roots had claimed, and she reached into her satchel. She took the heart thread, unwound it slowly, then tied it from one stone to the next, pulling it tight across the gap like a line between moments. Then she whispered, "This far," and tied it off. She turned to leave but paused. From the ravine something moved, not with sound, but with unmaking. The air turned slightly. The light dimmed, though no clouds passed, and for a moment she saw it, not fully, only the idea of it, the shape of forgetting. It hovered just past the thread, unable or unwilling to cross. It did not rage, it did not wail, it watched. And Merelda whispered once more, louder this time, "This far." Then she left it there, thread tight, wall held, a gate not of stone, but of story. That night, she marked the thread's place on a fresh piece of parchment. She wrote not in common script, but in the glyphs of her grandmother's tongue, symbols that meant stop, remember, turn back, stand firm. She hung the parchment above her bed. She drank valerian and fennel to ease the ache in her bones. And as she drifted into sleep, she dreamed of the thread across the stones, not fraying, not pulling, but singing. A song too old for words, but loud enough that even the thing in the ravine could not ignore it. The 22nd morning rose gray. thick with fog so dense it made the world feel smaller, as though the trees had drawn closer during the night and now stood shoulder to shoulder in quiet council. The air was wet and still, and when Merelda stepped outside, she could see only the shapes of things, blurred outlines of the hawthorn, the faint silhouette of her own loom through the open window. Even her breath vanished into the mist without a sound, but the thread across the stone wall still held. She knew without needing to see it. There was a pressure in the world now, not heavy but constant, as though something large had paused just outside of knowing and had decided, for the moment, not to knock. Merelda pulled her shawl tighter and returned to her fire. She placed a pot of water on to boil, added dried mullein and yarrow, then the last of her dried plum slices, sweetness for strength. The scent rose slow and steady, the kind that clings to memory. She needed her mind clear, because today she would begin the naming cloth, the final piece of the weave. Not for herself, not even for those she had known, but for the ones no one remembered, the lost ones. The children never held, the names never spoken, the voices that had been swallowed before they had learned how to echo. This cloth would be their shape, a tapestry not of faces, but of room. A place within the thread where they could be known. She brought out the large loom. It had been stored beneath the floorboards for years, taken out only twice before, once during the long famine, once when the fever passed through the southern hills. Now its frame bore scratches and age, but the wood was strong, the warp beams true. It welcomed her touch like an old friend, needing no explanation. She tied the warp threads carefully, evenly spaced, her hands sure and steady. Each was dyed with memory, green for springborns, gray for the unnamed, deep brown for those taken by silence. Then she reached into her memory baskets, bowls filled with pieces of story. A lock of hair curled like smoke from the baby Morella had buried without a name. A ribbon from the dancer whose song had ended in winter. A thorn from the old woman who never spoke but hummed lullabies to the bees. Every weft thread came from a tale, and with each pass of the shuttle, she gave it back, not with sound, but with shape. The cloth grew slowly, line by line, a quiet record of what had been unheld. Merelda did not rush. Her shoulders ached, her fingers burned, but she kept going, because if she stopped, they might vanish again, and this time completely. By dusk, the cloth reached the length of her arm, wide as her chest. She traced her fingers across its surface. It did not shimmer, it did not glow, but it throbbed, as though it had begun to breathe. She left it on the loom and stepped outside. The fog had begun to lift, just slightly. The trees remained quiet, but there was a looseness in their stillness now, like breath just beginning after a long hold. She walked slowly toward the ravine. The thread she had tied the day before was still stretched between the stones, taut and unbroken. But someone had left a mark. On the earth just before it, a single handprint pressed into the soil, not deep but unmistakable, small, a child's. Merelda stared, not in fear, in wonder, because she knew that print. It was the same shape Elna's hand had made once when she pressed it into flour beside the hearth, trying to copy the way Merelda measured by touch instead of sight. The child had passed through days ago, and yet she crouched, placed her own palm gently beside the print. The ground was warm, not unnaturally, not wrong, but witnessed. She stood again, eyes sweeping the tree line. No movement, but something had returned, not the creature, not the forgetting, but memory. Something she had remembered had begun to remember her back. She smiled. The work was not over, but it was answering. When she returned to the hut, she lit a second candle, not for light, for company. She set it beside the loom where the cloth still breathed and began to sing. Not words, not lyrics, but long vowel tones. The kind that carried through wood and thread and bone. A voice with no meaning, only presence. And the loom creaked softly beneath her hands. She would weave through the night, because every thread added now was a step forward, and every name given shape was one the dark could no longer take. The 23rd day was not marked by dawn. Instead, it emerged slowly from the dark, like the edge of a blanket being lifted away from the face of the earth. There was no sudden brightness, only a slow graying of the sky. A hush lingered long after the first bird called. An old thrush, hoarse from disuse, its cry hesitant, as if unsure it would not be unmade in the middle of its song. Merelda did not move from the loom. She had woven through the night, not tirelessly, but relentlessly, like a wheel that refused to stop turning, even as the axle groaned and the grain split. Her fingers were blistered now, a thin thread of dried blood where a splinter had caught. She had not bandaged it. The pain kept her tethered. The cloth had grown. Now it stretched the full width of the loom, heavy in the middle, the weft thick with memory. There were places in it that rippled slightly, not mistakes, not warps, but echoes. The thread held more than story now. It held presence. When she ran her hand across it, she could feel warmth, not heat, but life, as if the cloth breathed, as if it listened. She whispered names as she worked, not always her own. Some came from dreams, others from whispers carried on wind. A few she had never heard before but knew to be true. Elswith of the Black Marsh, who never let go of her child's name, even when no one else remembered it. Kale, keeper of old maps, who sang to stones and buried secrets beneath moss. Tamari, who gave his shadow to another so they would not walk alone. Each name she spoke bound itself to the thread. Each one pushed back the thinning of the world. And yet, the thing in the woods was not idle. She could feel it now, closer than ever. It had learned, not to attack, not to challenge, but to shape. It no longer came as absence. Now it came in memory's skin, a familiar scent carried on the breeze, smoke from the past. A voice she had not heard in 40 years, calling her name in the exact tone her father used when she was 5. Even the candle beside her flickered in rhythm with the lullaby her mother used to hum as she twisted Merelda's hair before sleep. Falsehoods made from truth. She did not rise. She did not follow. Because this was the deepest trick of forgetting, to mimic remembrance so well that you no longer trust your own. So she reached for the last braid, the black thread, the end thread. It had waited in a jar sealed with pitch and beeswax, wrapped in hide, buried in salt. It had never touched light. It was spun long ago from wool mixed with ash, and she had kept it for only one purpose, to bind the weave closed. She threaded it through the shuttle with reverence. Her hands moved slower now, not from weakness, but from weight. This was the final scene, the last line in the song, the place where memory became anchor. She wove in silence, no names, no tones, just motion, just intention. And as the final row tightened beneath her fingers, she tied it with a knot only her grandmother had known, a knot not meant to be undone. The loom creaked once, then still. Merelda stood, lifting the cloth carefully. It was longer than her height now, heavier than she expected. She folded it with both hands, kissed its edge, and placed it in a linen wrap soaked lightly in cedar and rosemary. Then she walked out into the morning fog toward the hawthorn tree. It stood taller now. Or perhaps her eyes saw it differently. Its buds had begun to open, not into leaves, but into thread. Fine, green filaments stretching from branch to branch like veins of memory returned. Merelda knelt and buried the cloth beneath its roots, pressing the earth down gently, murmuring a single word with each handful. Stay, stay, stay. When the last of the soil was in place, the tree shivered, not in wind, in response, and something in the forest recoiled. Not far, but sharply. It had touched a wall, not stone, not iron, but memory held in place by 1,000 strands, and it did not know how to break it. Merelda stood. Her hands were raw, her eyes blurred, but her name had not left her, not even once. She returned to the hut without looking back. The fire inside had burned low, but it welcomed her. She wrapped herself in a wool blanket and sat by the embers, fingers trembling, voice quiet. The forgetting had not fled, but it had slowed, and in the slow she could finish. One more night, one more thread, and then the silence would have to choose, step forward and speak its name, or disappear into a world that refused to forget. The final day began before the sun dared rise. It came in the hush between dreams and waking, in the deep blue hour when even the forest hesitates to breathe. Merelda opened her eyes in that silence, not startled, not weary, only ready. Her body ached, her fingers throbbed from weaving, her voice was little more than a rasp, but her mind was clear. She had one thread left to spin, not for the cloth, not for the hearth, not even for the tree. This thread would not be worn or buried or hung in doorways. This was a naming thread, a final act, a line between breath and unmaking. She lit no fire. Instead, she sat in the center of the room where all her spinning had taken place, and with her oldest spindle, the one carved from bone and wound with glyphs too faded to read. She drew out a single strand of flax, soaked overnight in her own breath, steeped in smoke from the naming cloth's burial. As she spun, the world outside turned. She could feel it. The trees pressed in again, the wind fell still, the earth held its breath. It was here. The thing she had resisted for 23 days and nights, the thing that erased. She had never given it a name, because naming gave shape, and this thing existed in the cracks between, but today she would name it, with thread, with voice, with truth. She stood, the final thread wound tightly in her palm, and walked out the door. The hawthorn tree loomed now, taller than it had ever been, its roots exposed like fingers clawing upward, the green threads from its budding branches humming in tones she felt behind her eyes. At its base, the earth trembled faintly, not from movement, but from presence. Across the clearing, the thing waited. It did not hide now. It had form, a shape made of every story forgotten. It looked like no one. It sounded like nothing. But in its shadow, names vanished from memory like sand through water. And yet she stood. She took the thread, tied it to her wrist, and stepped forward. One pace, then another. The thing moved, a blur of hollow form, a gesture of doubt made flesh. Where it passed, the air grew thin, the sky lost color, the birds stilled in their nests. Merelda raised her hand and spoke, not loudly, but clearly. Your name is Silence, Walker. You are the breath held too long, the name not spoken, the grave unmarked. You are the dust on pages, the cracked photograph, the song left unfinished, and you will go no further. The thread around her wrist began to glow, not with fire, not with magic, but with recognition. The hawthorn tree shuddered, its branches bent low, not from wind, but from listening. And in that moment, the thing reached forward, not with hand, but with hunger. Merelda stepped into its shadow and tied the end of the thread to its edge, where absence met earth, where forgetting met flame. The thing convulsed. It tried to pull away, but the thread held, because the thread was not spun from wool. It was spun from remembrance, from names sung to sleeping children, from meals made for the dying, from stories told in corners when the candles burned low. It held with every memory that refused to vanish, and the thing screamed, not aloud, inward. It twisted, folded, shrank, and then unraveled, not all at once, but thread by thread, until it was only mist, then air, then a sigh, then nothing. Merelda stood in the clearing alone. The hawthorn straightened, the wind returned, and somewhere in the trees the birds began to sing again. She untied the thread from her wrist, now darkened to the color of coal, and placed it gently into the earth beneath the tree. Not buried, planted. She spoke one last word, remain, and the roots accepted it. Back in the hut, she poured herself water from the clay jar by the hearth. She sipped slowly. Her breath came easier. The silence that followed was not hollow. It was full of names, full of places, full of lives that would no longer be lost to the dark. She sat by her loom, touched the warp one last time, and whispered, I have done enough. Outside, the wind danced through the branches, and above, the sky turned from gray to gold. The forest remembered.